She is not my biological daughter. My father's voice violently echoed across the courtroom like a gunshot. For a paralyzed moment, absolutely no one moved. The air in that archaic Manhattan probate courtroom turned suffocatingly heavy, exactly like the atmosphere before a catastrophic thunderstorm breaks. I remember hearing the nerve-grating hum of the ceiling lights, the stealthy shuffle of someone adjusting their winter coat, and the piercing wail of a police siren outside on Fifth Avenue. But mostly I remember the deafening silence, because when Arthur Vance, the ruthless founder of Vance Global Innovations, a titan worth over $25 billion, stood in open court and shouted that sentence, he didn't just disown me. He mercilessly erased 38 years of my life. Judge Harrison blinked slowly behind his glasses. Across the blood-stained aisle, my stepmother, Evelyn, lowered her eyes like a mourner at a funeral, though the corner of her mouth twitched with a venomous smirk. My half-brother Damien sat rigidly beside her, staring straight ahead with that meticulously blank expression people wear when desperately trying not to look guilty. My father's high-priced corporate lawyer cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he declared, theatrically smoothing the front of his bespoke suit jacket. Mr. Vance's statement reflects newly discovered, indisputable biological evidence. Those toxic words hung in the suffocating air like cigarette smoke. I stayed perfectly seated, my hands resting quietly on the cold oak table. The wood's grain felt eerily familiar beneath my tense fingers. Manhattan courtrooms possess a distinct, decaying smell: old paper, polished wood, and coats soaked in decades of freezing snow. It is wildly ironic what trivial details your mind grips when your entire universe gets violently split in half. Because that is exactly the catastrophe that occurred that day. Before that cataclysmic moment, I had been Alexandra Vance, daughter of Arthur Vance, executive vice president at Vance Global Innovations, a woman who spent her entire adult life bleeding to build the empire my father started with one decrepit factory and a borrowed loan. After that exact moment, I was legally reduced to absolute nothing. My client, the lawyer continued shamelessly, has reason to believe Ms. Alexandra Vance is not biologically related to him. Therefore, she has absolutely no legal claim to the Vance family estate or its immense holdings. Behind me, someone in the gallery frantically whispered, $25 billion tends to make people whisper. The judge leaned forward aggressively. "Mr. Vance," he warned, his voice calm but lethally firm. "You are making a phenomenally serious declaration in this court. Are you prepared to support it?" My father cowardly refused to even look at me. "Yes," he stated flatly. "She isn't my daughter." I coldly studied the back of his graying head. The exact same hair I used to watch from his battered pickup truck when I was a kid riding to the factory. The same broad shoulders that once carried me during company picnics. I had spent my entire life worshipping my father as an unbreakable man of principle. But a creeping poison had violently changed him in recent years. Something that started with a whisper and ended in this exact slaughter.my lawyer, a predatory shark named Benjamin Hayes, who had ruthlessly practiced family law in Manhattan for decades, leaned slightly toward me. "Are you okay?" he whispered, his voice strung tight. I nodded resolutely. "I'm fine." The brutal truth was I had entirely anticipated this moment. Maybe not the exact theatrical words or the public screaming, but the cowardly betrayal itself. That specific treason hadn't surprised me in a very long time. The judge sharply adjusted a folder on his heavy desk. "Ms. Vance," he commanded, looking directly at me. "Do you have a response to your father's explosive claim?" I slowly stood up. The massive room always feels infinitely colder when you are the only one standing. "My response, Your Honor," I articulated with lethal precision, "is that this fabricated issue didn't appear until very recently." That was the undeniable truth. For 38 years, absolutely no one had ever dared question whether I belonged in the Vance family. Not when my mother was alive. Not when I graduated high school. Not when I earned my degree from Harvard. Not even when my father personally appointed me to the executive board decades ago. For my entire existence, I was simply Arthur Vance's unquestioned daughter until Evelyn arrived. Evelyn infiltrated our lives when I was 23. My mother had tragically died 2 years earlier after an agonizing battle with cancer. My father spent those desolate years ruthlessly buried in work, building Vance Global Innovations into a monstrous East Coast supplier. Then, Evelyn appeared. She was dangerously elegant, entirely composed, and decades younger than my father. She possessed that hypnotic, polished cadence that forces people to blindly believe she is telling the truth, even while dripping venom. At first, I genuinely tried to welcome her. Suffocating grief makes people desperately hopeful for peace. But that illusion of peace didn't last long in our house. Evelyn had a terrifying, toxic talent for rearranging things. Furniture, daily schedules, hushed conversations, and eventually, the people themselves. Within a single year, she smoothly manipulated my father into believing that Damien, her son from a previous marriage, should work at the company. Damien was just 12 then. I was 24 and already bleeding on the front lines to manage the massive operations division. It is sickeningly funny how time works, because decades later, Damien would be sitting smugly in that courtroom expecting to inherit absolutely everything. And I would be the woman they audaciously claimed had zero right to even sit at the table. My client possesses incontrovertible DNA evidence, the opposing lawyer continued smoothly. DNA, there it finally was. That chilling word rolled around the cavernous room like a marble dropped on hardwood. Cold science can shatter bloodlines infinitely faster than any emotional argument. The judge looked piercingly back at me. Ms. Vance? I reached down and deliberately opened the leather briefcase at my feet. Inside lay a razor-thin, simple manila folder. The paper inside weighed absolutely nothing, but I instinctively knew it possessed the power to catastrophically change everything. I snapped the briefcase shut. Not quite yet. My response, I repeated with icy calm, is that I demand the opportunity to present counter-evidence before this court blindly accepts that claim. The judge nodded firmly. That seems reasonable. Across the blood-stained aisle, Evelyn's paranoid eyes violently flickered toward my briefcase. Damien shifted nervously in his expensive chair. And for the absolute first time since the slaughter began, my father turned slightly in my direction. Not enough to actually look me in the eye, but just enough to notice the edge of that folder. For just a microscopic fraction of a second, I saw raw, unadulterated fear flash across his face. That was the exact moment I knew. Whatever monstrous truth lived inside that envelope, he was entirely unequipped to survive it. And neither were the parasites sitting beside him. I rested my hand quietly on the leather and smiled a predator's smile, waiting. Because sometimes, the most deafening, powerful moment in a courtroom absolutely isn't when someone is speaking. It is the agonizing suspense when everyone realizes a fatal blow is coming, and they have absolutely no idea what it is. If I truly wasn't Arthur Vance's daughter, then why had he spent the last 5 years frantically trying to ensure no one ever excavated the buried truth? That explosive question would very soon have a devastating answer. And when it finally detonated, someone in that room was going to violently wish they had never opened this bloodbath of a case. After the judge granted permission to present evidence, the courtroom took a brief, tense recess. People immediately stood, stretched, and frantically whispered. Highly paid lawyers stepped into the hallway to make urgent calls. The soft, grating scrape of chairs violently echoed across the room. I remained perfectly seated. After surviving so many corporate bloodbaths, you learn a vital truth about storms. Sometimes, it is best to simply sit still and let the deafening thunder pass over you before deciding where to strike next. As I sat in that suffocating Manhattan courtroom waiting for the executioner's hearing to resume, my mind violently drifted decades backward to a timeline when the Vance name meant something entirely different. Back when the corporate empire was small, and back when my father still genuinely smiled. I grew up in a modest, drafty brick house in Brooklyn, New York, just across the river from downtown Manhattan. In the late 70s and early 80s, Brooklyn wasn't the bustling, gentrified district it is today. Back then, it still felt like a tight-knit community where people waved at stoplights and local hardware store owners actually knew your name. My father, Arthur Vance, was absolutely not a ruthless billionaire in those days. He was simply a fiercely determined man with dark grease under his fingernails and a stubborn, unyielding dream. Vance Global Innovations originally started in a decaying, rented warehouse near the East River. At the time, it was just my father, 2 battered machines, and a small, exhausted team making custom tech components for local manufacturers. I used to violently perch on a splintered wooden stool in the corner of that freezing warehouse, doing my homework while the heavy machinery hummed with a deafening roar. The visceral stench of heated metal and industrial oil still violently brings those memories rushing back. My mother, Sarah Vance, believed in my father's vision more fiercely than absolutely anyone else in the world. She meticulously kept the financial books for the struggling business right from our cramped kitchen table. Every single night after dinner, she would spread towering stacks of invoices and ledgers across the table while my father intensely discussed incoming orders and cutthroat contracts. They were absolute partners in the most profound sense of the word. I was their only, fiercely loved child. And in those grueling early years, my father absolutely never treated me like anything less than a vital piece of the company. "Come here, Alexandra," he would command, waving me over to one of the towering machines. "You want to understand a brutal truth about business?" I would nod eagerly. "Machines inevitably break," he would state, wiping his grease-stained hands on a filthy rag. "Cutthroat deals fall through. But people will eternally remember exactly how you treat them. That is the ultimate, untouchable currency." I vividly remember the exact, cursed afternoon the real nightmare began. It was early autumn, one of those deceptively bright New York days when the air smells sharply of dead leaves and a freezing wind whips off the Hudson. I was barricaded in my executive office at Vance Global Innovations, ruthlessly tearing through quarterly financial reports, when my assistant knocked timidly on the heavy door. "Alexandra," she murmured nervously, "your father is demanding to see you in the executive boardroom immediately." I grabbed my leather notebook and marched down the sterile hallway. Back in those days, I was the undisputed executive vice president of operations. I had been bleeding for that empire for nearly 2 relentless decades. The vast majority of our veteran employees had known me since I was a filthy teenager, scrubbing grimy floors in the original warehouse. Vance Global Innovations had monstrously mutated far beyond that pathetic first factory near the East River. We now commanded sprawling manufacturing facilities across 3 states and held absolute monopolies on cutthroat contracts with several major tech suppliers. I was fiercely, unapologetically proud of that staggering empire, because my own blood had helped build every single inch of it. When I pushed open the boardroom doors that afternoon, my father was already entrenched like a king at the absolute head of the massive oak table. Evelyn sat immediately beside him. Damien lounged arrogantly across from her. And the company's ruthless corporate assassin, Mr. Reeves, aggressively guarded a lethal stack of legal documents right in front of him. That exact visual alone made my stomach violently tighten into knots. High-stakes corporate assassins absolutely do not attend casual afternoon catch-ups. "Take a seat, Alexandra," my father commanded, his voice sounded horribly hollow and dangerous. I slowly took a chair near the center of the battlefield. "What exactly is going on here?" I demanded. Mr. Reeves coldly cleared his throat like an executioner. "Ms. Vance," he articulated carefully, "Mr. Vance has formally decided to fundamentally restructure the executive leadership of the entire corporation." I snapped my burning gaze toward my father. "Restructure how, exactly?" My father cowardly rubbed his temple. "Damien has been demonstrating very good work lately," he muttered. Damien had been coasting through a fabricated position at the Empire for about 4 agonizing years by then, mostly playing pretend in finance. "He is barely still learning the absolute basics," I fired back. "That is precisely why I want him to assume a much higher level of absolute responsibility," my father retorted stubbornly. Evelyn's lips curled into a sickeningly triumphant smile. "We firmly believe it is finally time for Damien to assume a seat on the executive board." That apocalyptic statement hung in the suffocating room like toxic smoke. Handing a board seat to a boy in a multi-billion-dollar empire wasn't just casual nepotism, it was absolute madness. Board seats meant unchecked, supreme power. "Fine," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously slow whisper. Who exactly is stepping down to make room? The lethal answer didn't come from my family, it came from the corporate assassin. You are. For a paralyzing fraction of a second, I genuinely thought I had hallucinated his words. Excuse me? I breathed out. My father brutally refused to meet my furious eyes. This is strictly business, it isn't personal, he lied. Evelyn leaned forward, placing a manicured, venomous hand gently on his tense arm. Arthur truly believes that an infusion of fresh, dynamic leadership will help the empire fiercely evolve, she manipulated effortlessly. Fresh leadership. After 20 years of shedding blood to build the Global Operations Division from the absolute ground up, after ruthlessly negotiating cutthroat contracts that generated tens of billions of dollars in pure revenue, after nearly killing myself working 80-hour weeks while Damien was barely figuring out how to read a simple balance sheet. You are actively stripping me of the board? I asked quietly. My father offered one single, cowardly nod. It is time. That was absolutely all he said, no defense, no debate, just those two hollow, apocalyptic words. It is time that I remember driving back to my penthouse that night in absolute silence, watching the towering skyline of Manhattan glowing like a distant inferno across the freezing, pitch-black waters of the Hudson. I desperately tried to rationalize that massive corporate leviathans restructure all the time. Maybe this truly was just a ruthless business maneuver. But deep down in my bones, my predatory instinct screamed that a slaughter was coming. And over the next few excruciating months, the psychological warfare rapidly escalated. My father aggressively froze me out of every major operational decision. Evelyn suddenly began slithering into high-level executive meetings she had absolutely zero prior interest in. Damien abruptly gained unrestricted access to highly classified financial ledgers that used to require my explicit, personal authorization. Then, roughly 6 agonizing months later, the ultimate, cataclysmic betrayal detonated. My father summoned a mandatory family meeting at the fortified estate in Brooklyn. We sat in the suffocatingly silent living room, right next to where my late mother's grand piano still stood like a ghost against the wall. My father coldly slid a thick, wax-sealed envelope across the table. What exactly is this? I demanded, my guard instantly up. My completely revised estate will, he answered flatly. I tore it open. The heavily redacted legal document inside was agonizingly short, brutally simple, and absolutely devastating. Nearly every single one of his controlling ownership shares in Vance Global Innovations, an untouchable empire worth upwards of $25 billion, was legally being surrendered entirely to Damien. My rightful legacy had been violently amputated and reduced to a pathetically microscopic trust fund. It was the exact kind of insulting, token inheritance you toss to a distant, forgotten relative. Dad, I choked out slowly, my hands violently trembling with sheer rage, this has to be a catastrophic mistake. It is not, he replied without blinking. You swore to me my entire life that this empire would stay in the bloodline. I screamed. It will, he replied with sickening calm. I stared at him, my heart shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. I am your bloodline. Evelyn shifted uncomfortably, adjusting her posture. Arthur Vance cowardishly avoided my burning gaze yet again. I have made my final decision, he finalized. I stormed out of that cursed estate that night feeling like the very foundation of my existence had been violently blown to pieces. But the most terrifying puzzle piece didn't fall into place until a few weeks later. I was conducting a brutal, unannounced inspection at one of our massive manufacturing plants in Queens when one of the grizzled veteran floor managers nervously pulled me into the shadows. His name was Marcus Thorne. Marcus had bled for my father since the very first day in that drafty warehouse. He was a deeply paranoid man who guarded his words like gold. Alexandra, he whispered urgently, his eyes darting around the noisy factory floor. I desperately need to ask you something highly confidential. What's wrong, Marcus? I demanded. He nervously wiped the sweat off the back of his neck. Look, it's probably a massive misunderstanding. Spit it out, Marcus, I ordered. Marcus leaned in so close I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. Your father secretly hired a highly covert private investigator late last year. My heart violently skipped a beat. A covert investigator? Marcus gave a grim nod. I personally intercepted the discreet billing invoices bleeding through the shadow accounts. Investigating what exactly? I demanded. Marcus hesitated, looking genuinely terrified. Something highly classified regarding archived hospital records. Hospital records. Those two terrifying words sent a glacial chill surging through my veins. Which hospital, Marcus? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Grace Memorial, Marcus confessed. Grace Memorial Hospital. The exact hospital where I drew my very first breath on this earth. That was the exact, apocalyptic moment I realized a horrifying conspiracy was actively hunting me from the shadows. Something monstrous that my father was desperately trying to keep buried. And if I wanted to survive this ruthless bloodbath, I was going to have to excavate the explosive truth myself. That night, I sat paralyzed at my kitchen table with my laptop open and a single, catastrophic question echoing relentlessly in my mind. Why would my father covertly investigate the exact hospital where I was born? The explosive answer to that question would ultimately drag me down a terrifying path I never could have expected. And eventually straight into the heart of that Manhattan courtroom. That night, after Marcus Thorne exposed the horrifying truth about the private investigator, sleep completely abandoned me. When you reach your late 30s, especially after surviving cutthroat corporate warfare, you develop a blood-curdling instinct for impending doom. It isn't the same frantic, restless fear you experience in your youth. It is far more insidious, a quiet, lethal whisper in the back of your mind warning you that the ground is about to collapse. And once you hear that haunting voice, it becomes utterly impossible to ignore. I sat frozen at my kitchen table in my sprawling penthouse overlooking the freezing waters of the Hudson River in downtown Manhattan. Outside, the city's streetlights reflected like fractured glass on the dark water, while an occasional car sped over the bridge in the dead of night. The penthouse was dead quiet. Suffocatingly quiet. I forcefully opened my laptop and aggressively typed the exact words that had been violently tearing through my thoughts all evening. Grace Memorial Hospital records. Grace Memorial had been permanently shuttered and demolished years earlier. Hospitals rise and fall, especially the archaic, smaller institutions that operated back in the late 70s and early 80s. But cataclysmic medical records do not simply vanish into thin air. They are meticulously archived, transferred, and buried in subterranean vaults most people never even know exist. I spent 2 agonizing hours relentlessly digging through digital archives before I finally leaned back, my blood running cold. The original birth records from Grace Memorial had been transferred to a heavily fortified medical archive deep in New York City after the hospital's closure in the early 2000s, which absolutely guaranteed those explosive documents still existed. The burning question was terrifyingly simple. Why had a billionaire titan like Arthur Vance deployed a covert operative to excavate them? I made a ruthless decision right then and there that I was not going to sit like a victim and wait for the slaughter to come to me. I was going to hunt down the truth myself. At the crack of dawn, I made an emergency call to Benjamin Hayes. Benjamin had been my father's most lethal corporate attorney for many years before aggressively shifting his loyalty to become mine. He was an imposing man of 71 with sharp silver hair, a deceptively calm cadence, and the predatory patience that only decades of surviving Manhattan's bloodiest courtroom wars can forge in a person. Alexandra, he answered instantly, his voice sharp, what exactly is going on? I need to ask you something incredibly disturbing, I replied. Disturbing is my specialty, he retorted dryly. I ruthlessly detailed every single horrifying word Marcus Thorne had confessed in the shadows of the warehouse. When I finished, an apocalyptic silence hung on the line. Well, Benjamin finally rasped, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper, if your father secretly deployed a private investigator to excavate hospital records from the exact year you were born, there are only a handful of catastrophic reasons he might do that. Like what? I demanded. Questions regarding your absolute identity, he stated. My stomach violently tightened into a knot. You mean paternity, Benjamin declared without a shred of hesitation. That singular, destructive word detonated like a bomb and hung suffocatingly heavy in the air between us. Do you actually believe that? I choked out. I absolutely never believe anything until I possess the irrefutable evidence in my hands, he replied coldly. But if a billionaire is aggressively investigating birth records from nearly 4 decades ago, paternity is almost always the apocalyptic question he is desperate to answer. I stared blankly at the freezing river outside my towering window. For 38 years, I had never once questioned whether Arthur Vance was my true flesh and blood. Not for a single second. What should our next move be? I asked, my voice turning to ice. Benjamin didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. We must infiltrate those archives and seize the records before they obliterate them. So that is exactly the ruthless offensive we launched. 2 days later, Benjamin and I descended into the labyrinth of New York City together. The centralized medical archive was buried inside an imposing, fortress-like administrative building near the decaying old medical district. It felt vastly more like a desolate purgatory than a hospital facility, endless, suffocating rows of towering steel filing cabinets, nauseatingly flickering fluorescent lights, and administrative staff members who spoke in the paranoid, hushed whispers reserved for crypts where the buried secrets are decades older than the people reading them. A grim-faced clerk named Carla approached us at the heavy security desk. Birth records from Grace Memorial, she murmured dryly. What exact year? 1988, Benjamin commanded with absolute authority. She tapped lethargically on her archaic computer terminal. That excavation may take quite a while. We sat in agonizing suspense for nearly 40 minutes while she navigated the subterranean archive system. Finally, she emerged from the shadows clutching a razor-thin, decaying manila folder. This should be the complete file, she stated, sliding the folder across the cold metal table. I tore it open, my hands trembling with sheer adrenaline. Inside lay several fragile pages of typed medical forms, hospital admission logs, and a faded copy of my original birth certificate. Printed clearly at the very top of the primary document were the names. Mother, Sarah Vance. Father, Arthur Vance. They were my parents. It was the exact same unshakable truth I had believed for my entire existence. Benjamin leaned aggressively forward, his predatory eyes scanning the documents with surgical precision. Everything appears completely standard, he muttered. But a creeping, undeniable dread regarding the file violently gnawed at my instincts. I ruthlessly flipped through the decaying pages a second time. And that was the exact, horrifying moment I spotted it. A microscopic, almost invisible line typed at the very bottom margin of one of the supplementary forms. Record retroactively amended in 1990. Benjamin, I breathed out, my voice laced with ice, pointing a rigid finger at the microscopic text. He sharply adjusted his glasses and leaned in dangerously close to inspect the anomaly. Fascinating, he whispered darkly. What in God's name does that mean? I demanded. It means the original, primary record was legally altered exactly 2 years after you were born, he stated. My heart violently slammed against my ribs like a trapped bird. Altered how? I choked out. That is the million-dollar question, Benjamin replied grimly. We ruthlessly pressured Carla, demanding to know if the vault contained the unamended, original version of the registry. She vanished back into the archives and eventually returned clutching a crumbling, heavily yellowed piece of paper. The document was severely faded by the decades, but the catastrophic information printed at the top made the air completely vanish from my lungs. The mother's name was still undeniably listed as Sarah Vance, but the space legally designated for the biological father was utterly, chillingly blank. Benjamin turned to me, his expression hardening into absolute stone. Well, he breathed out softly, the horrifying reality dawning on him, that perfectly explains why a billionaire dispatched a covert operative to dig this up. My hands turned to solid ice. So, what is the ultimate truth here? I asked, my voice trembling with rage. It means that on the exact day you drew your first breath, the hospital officially registered you without a father," he concluded. I stared down at the devastating piece of paper in absolute horror. My entire life, I had blindly believed my birth certificate cemented an unbreakable, royal bloodline. But now, I was staring at incontrovertible proof that my entire 38-year-old legacy was a meticulously orchestrated lie, manipulated 2 years after I was brought into this world. Could they have legally forged or added my father's name long after the fact? I demanded. Absolutely, Benjamin confirmed with lethal certainty. That bureaucratic maneuver occurs occasionally if the parents formally file a retroactive amendment. But why on earth would Arthur Vance wait 2 agonizing years to officially claim me? I pressed. That, Benjamin replied, his eyes narrowing, is the monstrous secret we are going to violently tear out of the shadows. Over the next few frantic, blood-boiling weeks, Benjamin and I plunged infinitely deeper into this terrifying rabbit hole. We covertly engaged an elite genetic specialist, aggressively commissioned an impenetrable barrage of high-stakes DNA analyses, and relentlessly hunted down a retired nurse who had commanded the Grace Memorial Maternity Ward back in the late 80s. The frail woman's name was Margaret Bell. She was 82 years old and wasting away in a desolate, frost-covered retirement estate tucked away in upstate New York. When Benjamin and I infiltrated her dimly lit parlor, she scrutinized my face with agonizing intensity for a long, heavy moment. "You possess your mother's exact, striking features," she murmured, her voice fragile but lucid. "You actually remember her?" I asked, stunned. "Oh, absolutely," Margaret confirmed with a wistful nod. "Sarah Vance was a woman of extraordinary grace." I hesitated. "Do you recall anything catastrophic or unusual occurring on the exact day I was born?" Margaret's eyes clouded with a sudden, dark hesitation. "Well," she began, her pale hands trembling slightly, "the maternity wards were chaotic war zones in those days. We lacked the impenetrable, digitized security grids that exist today." "What exactly are you implying, Ms. Bell?" Benjamin pressed, his voice sharp as a scalpel. She folded her hands tightly in her lap, the weight of a decades-old sin suffocating her words. "I am confessing that in the suffocating rush, fatal administrative anomalies occurred." "Anomalies?" I repeated, my blood running cold. Margaret gave a slow, devastating nod. Infants, on exceedingly rare occasions, were catastrophically mixed up. The freezing parlor plunged into an absolute, paralyzed silence. "What magnitude of mix-ups?" Benjamin demanded relentlessly. Margaret looked directly into my eyes, delivering the fatal blow. "The apocalyptic kind that irrevocably shatters bloodlines and destroys families forever." Those chilling, monstrous words echoed violently in my skull for the entire agonizing drive back to Manhattan. Because by that critical juncture, our biological samples had already been dispatched to the elite genetic laboratory. And in a mere 3 weeks, we were going to possess the irrefutable, scientific truth, no matter how utterly destructive that truth turned out to be. But even then, sitting in the back of that town car with Margaret Bell's horrifying words ringing in my ears, my instincts screamed that this conspiracy was going to be astronomically bigger than any of us had ever hallucinated. Infinitely bigger. And when those explosive DNA results finally detonated, someone in my treacherous family was going to violently wish they had never opened this bloodbath of a door. When the judge ruthlessly called the courtroom back to order, his heavy wooden gavel produced a sharp, deafening crack that instantly settled the chaotic room into an anxious paralysis. "Proceed," Judge Harrison commanded, signaling that the executioner's hearing had finally reached the cataclysmic point everyone had been holding their breath for. Across the blood-stained aisle, Evelyn's impeccably tailored attorney stood up first. His name was Daniel Hargrave, a quintessential, predatory Manhattan corporate shark who looked exactly as though he had just confidently stepped out of a glossy magazine advertisement for exorbitantly expensive bespoke suits. "Your Honor," he began with a sickeningly smooth cadence. "The matter before this court is absolutely simple." Nothing about this apocalyptic slaughter felt remotely simple to me. "Mr. Arthur Vance," he continued relentlessly, "possesses undeniable reason to believe that Ms. Alexandra Vance is absolutely not his biological daughter. Recent, highly advanced genetic testing incontrovertibly supports this claim. He theatrically lifted a razor-thin manila folder. Therefore, under the strict parameters of New York inheritance law, Ms. Vance possesses absolutely no standing to claim biological status as a legitimate Vance heir. Mr. Vance's revised estate plan, which rightfully grants the supreme, controlling company shares to his son, Damien, must unequivocally stand. Damien shifted greedily in his chair the precise second his name was spoken. Evelyn folded her perfectly manicured hands neatly in her lap, radiating a manufactured, toxic innocence. My father simply stared blankly straight ahead. Hargrave strutted slowly across the archaic courtroom floor and handed a lethal document directly to the judge. A preliminary DNA analysis, he declared. It indicates absolutely zero biological relationship between Mr. Vance and Ms. Alexandra Vance. The judge read silently for several agonizing seconds. I intensely watched his sharp eyes dart across the fateful page. Finally, he looked up. Ms. Vance, he inquired, slowly turning his piercing gaze toward me. Do you dispute these catastrophic findings? My formidable attorney, Benjamin Hayes, remained perfectly seated beside me, radiating an icy calm. He had ruthlessly practiced law long enough to master the lethal art of timing. Sometimes, an absolute, paralyzing silence is the most devastating weapon in a courtroom. I stood up with slow, deliberate defiance. Yes, Your Honor, I articulated clearly. Hargrave offered a faint, arrogant sneer. On what possible grounds? I rested my hand lightly on the rigid back of my mahogany chair. On the indisputable grounds that the evidence presented is pathetically incomplete. Incomplete? Hargrave repeated, his smugness faltering slightly. Yes. Judge Harrison sharply adjusted his spectacles. Ms. Vance, are you directly suggesting that this DNA analysis is fabricated or incorrect? No, Your Honor. A violent, confused murmur immediately ripped through the crowded gallery. Even the predatory Hargrave looked momentarily paralyzed by my audacity. If the genetic test is flawlessly accurate, the judge stated with extreme caution, then Mr. Arthur Vance is indeed not your biological father. That is absolutely correct. The cavernous room plunged into a suffocating, horrified hush. Across the blood-stained aisle, Evelyn's perfectly sculpted eyebrows lifted slightly in sheer bewilderment. Damien leaned back lazily in his expensive chair. My father finally turned his head toward me, and for the very first time that apocalyptic day, we locked eyes. He looked profoundly uneasy, not remotely triumphant, just deeply, unspeakably uneasy. Then upon what rational basis, the judge demanded, do you challenge this massive inheritance claim? I reached down and grasped the razor-thin manila folder from my leather briefcase, the exact same folder Evelyn had been paranoidly fixated on since this bloodbath began. Because the tragic story absolutely does not end there, I stated coldly. I stepped up from behind the heavy oak table and approached the towering judge's bench. The entire courtroom felt as though it was collectively holding its breath. I placed the folder with deliberate gentleness onto the polished mahogany desk directly in front of Judge Harrison. This, I declared with lethal quietness, is the complete, unredacted DNA report. Hargrave frowned deeply, his arrogance slipping. Your Honor, may I immediately review that document? The judge reluctantly handed him the explosive document. Hargrave rapidly scanned the first page, and then the second. His expression mutated slowly, horrifyingly. The arrogant, flushed color violently drained from his face. For a corporate shark who had confidently strutted into this courtroom radiating absolute certainty, he suddenly looked exactly like a doomed man who had just gleefully stepped onto shattering ice. Evelyn frantically leaned toward him. What is it? She hissed in a panic. He absolutely refused to answer her. Instead, his trembling hands surrendered the lethal document right back to the judge. Judge Harrison began reading the catastrophic pages. His gray eyebrows shot upward in sheer disbelief. Well, he murmured softly. That single, weighted word violently traveled across the silent room like a spark igniting a powder keg. Benjamin Hayes rose to his feet right beside me. Your Honor, he commanded with lethal calm, if the court will generously allow, we would like to explicitly explain the full, devastating findings. The judge offered a sharp nod. Please do. Benjamin turned his body slightly to face the paralyzed courtroom. 3 months ago, he began his executioner's speech. Ms. Vance initiated a desperate, private investigation into her own birth records after horrifyingly discovering that her father had covertly deployed a private investigator to review archived hospital documents from Grace Memorial Hospital in 1988. Evelyn shifted violently again in her expensive seat. Benjamin pressed on relentlessly. During that exhaustive investigation, we unearthed the terrifying fact that Ms. Vance's original, primary birth record had been retroactively, legally amended exactly 2 years after her delivery. Judge Harrison cast a dark glance back down at the DNA report. Go on. Driven by that catastrophic anomaly, Benjamin declared, we aggressively conducted our own comprehensive genetic testing. He paused for one agonizing, devastating second, including tests involving not only Ms. Alexandra and Mr. Vance. His predatory gaze snapped directly onto Damien. But also Mr. Damien. Damien stiffened in absolute horror. Evelyn's manicured hand gripped the edge of the mahogany table like a desperate talon. What exactly are you insinuating? Hargrave demanded, his voice cracking. Benjamin folded his hands with a terrifying, icy calm. I am stating a scientific absolute. The DNA results reveal something infinitely more unexpected. Judge Harrison looked up from the lethal pages. Unexpected, indeed. My father had gone completely, paralyzingly still. You see, Benjamin continued, unleashing the killing blow, the genetic results absolutely confirm that Ms. Alexandra Vance is not biologically related to Mr. Arthur Vance. Hargrave straightened his posture slightly, exhaling a pathetic breath of relief. Then our legal claim unequivocally stands. Benjamin raised a single, commanding finger. However, the entire courtroom physically leaned forward on the edge of the abyss. That exact same genetic analysis irrefutably confirms that Mr. Damien is also completely biologically unrelated to Mr. Arthur Vance. Absolute silence. Not the quiet, gossiping murmur kind. The absolute, paralyzed kind of silence. The terrifying hush that violently drops when an apocalyptic truth smashes into a room like a colossal boulder plummeting into deep, dark water. Damien stared blankly at Benjamin. What? He choked out. Evelyn's aristocratic face had gone completely, horrifyingly pale. That is absolutely impossible, she shrieked. Benjamin turned smoothly back toward the judge. The indisputable genetic evidence dictates that absolutely neither child shares a single drop of paternal DNA with Mr. Vance. Judge Harrison nodded with agonizing slowness, which immediately forces us to confront an obvious, catastrophic question. Benjamin finished the fatal sentence for him. What on earth happened in the maternity ward of Grace Memorial Hospital in 1988? In that monumental fraction of a second, every single living soul in that Manhattan courtroom seemed to simultaneously grasp the horrifying, world-shattering implication. The frail, retired nurse's devastating confession violently echoed in my skull. Babies, on exceedingly rare occasions, were catastrophically mixed up. Across the blood-stained aisle, my father's massive hands trembled violently on the oak table. And for the absolute first time since this nightmare began, he looked genuinely, profoundly terrified. Because the monstrous truth currently resting on that judge's desk was astronomically bigger and more destructive than anyone in that courtroom had ever dared to hallucinate. And once Judge Harrison finished ruthlessly reading the remainder of that explosive report, there would be absolutely no power on earth capable of forcing that catastrophic truth back into the shadows. The absolute silence in the cavernous courtroom stretched so agonizingly long that even the faint, nerve-grating hum of the overhead fluorescent lights sounded deafening. Judge Harrison kept reading the explosive report, page after catastrophic page. Across the blood-stained aisle, Evelyn had finally stopped her frantic, toxic whispering. She stared directly at the lethal report in the judge's hands, as if she could somehow violently will the words on the paper to change. Damien simply looked profoundly confused, more than anything else. My father looked exactly like a hollowed-out man who had just seen a ghost. Finally, Judge Harrison placed the devastating report down carefully on his heavy mahogany desk. "Well," he murmured slowly, his voice echoing in the dead silence. "This court appears to be dealing with a rather unusual situation." That was the understatement of the century. Benjamin Hayes stepped forward, commanding the room. "Your Honor, if I may explicitly clarify the findings." "Please do," the judge permitted. Benjamin turned slightly to face the paralyzed courtroom. "The DNA testing conducted by the elite laboratory unequivocally confirms two absolute truths," he stated with lethal calm. "First, Ms. Alexandra Vance is absolutely not biologically related to Mr. Arthur Vance." Evelyn exhaled loudly, almost with desperate relief. But Benjamin wasn't remotely finished unleashing the slaughter. "Second," he continued mercilessly, "Mr. Damien is also completely not biologically related to Mr. Arthur Vance." That fleeting relief vanished instantly, replaced by sheer horror. Damien leaned violently forward in his chair. "What the hell are you talking about?" he spat. Evelyn desperately grabbed his arm. "Don't say anything," she hissed. But Damien aggressively shook her hand off. "That's completely ridiculous," he shouted loudly. "I am his son." Benjamin gestured politely but lethally toward the report on the bench. "The incontrovertible DNA evidence absolutely disagrees." Damien frantically looked at his mother. "Mom?" Evelyn's lips parted slightly in bloodless shock, but absolutely no words came out. Judge Harrison cleared his throat sharply. "Let's maintain strict order in this courtroom," he commanded. Then he turned his piercing gaze toward Benjamin. "You believe there was a catastrophic hospital error?" "Yes, Your Honor," Benjamin confirmed. The judge leaned back slowly in his heavy leather chair. "Explain." Benjamin smoothly opened another meticulously prepared folder. "During our exhaustive investigation, we interviewed a retired nurse who commanded the Grace Memorial Hospital maternity ward back in 1988. She personally confirmed that devastating record-keeping errors occasionally occurred in their chaotic ward." He paused for a fraction of a second, letting the tension peak. "In exceptionally rare, apocalyptic cases, infants were mistakenly switched." A quiet, horrifying ripple of absolute shock violently moved through the crowded gallery. Damien aggressively shook his head. "No way," he muttered. Evelyn's voice finally returned, sharp, hysterical, and incredibly defensive. "That is utterly absurd." Benjamin remained terrifyingly calm. "We also covertly obtained archived hospital staffing records and internal administrative reports from that exact time period. There was, in fact, a severely buried incident documented in March of 1988 involving two newborns." The judge looked darkly down at the file again. "And Ms. Vance was born in March of 1988. "Yes," Benjamin affirmed. I could physically feel dozens of burning eyes in the courtroom violently shift toward me. 38 years. That is exactly how long I had lived, blindly believing one unshakable version of my legacy. Now, in the brutal span of just 15 minutes, my entire universe had completely unraveled. Judge Harrison steepled his fingers. "Mr. Vance," he demanded, aiming his piercing gaze directly at my father. "Were you actively aware of this catastrophic possibility before today?" My father's jaw violently tightened. For several agonizing seconds, he said absolutely nothing. Then, heavily, he nodded slowly. "Yes." The courtroom violently erupted. Horrified gasps, frantic whispers. Even the stoic court reporter completely stopped typing for a paralyzed moment. "You knew?" The scream violently tore from my throat before I could physically stop myself. My furious voice echoed across the cavernous room. My father still cowardly refused to look at me. "Yes," he rasped quietly. "How long?" I demanded, my blood turning to liquid nitrogen. "Years." That single, devastating word violently hit me harder than absolutely anything else that day. "Years." Judge Harrison leaned aggressively forward again. "Mr. Vance, Please explain yourself. My father heavily rubbed his trembling forehead. About 5 years ago, he began, his voice fracturing. Evelyn found something. Evelyn stiffened violently beside him. A letter? The judge frowned. What kind of letter? My father finally, slowly turned his eyes toward me, and what I saw in them wasn't arrogance, it was an ocean of something I had never seen before, suffocating shame. Your mother left it before she died, he confessed. My chest violently tightened. My mother? He gave a slow nod. She wrote it shortly before she passed away. The entire massive room seemed to suffocatingly shrink around me. What exactly did it say? I asked. My father swallowed hard. She had privately discovered the amended hospital records. The judge leaned forward, deeply invested. She believed there had been a catastrophic mix-up. The horrific words hung there suspended between us like a guillotine. A mix-up. Damien stared at his mother again, his eyes wide with betrayal. Did you know about this? Evelyn frantically shook her head quickly. No. But the violent tremor in her panicked voice completely betrayed her lies. My father continued speaking, his voice breaking. Your mother didn't want to tell you, he said directly to me. She said it didn't matter at all. Tears burned my eyes. That profound, selfless grace sounded exactly like her. She fiercely believed that a family wasn't about blood or biology. I took a slow, trembling breath. Then why on earth bring it up now? I demanded. My father's gaze snapped toward Evelyn. For the very first time that apocalyptic day, there was pure, vicious anger in his expression. Because someone else found the letter. Evelyn's face instantly drained of all its aristocratic color. You promised not to mention that, she hissed defensively in a panic. Judge Harrison raised a highly judgmental eyebrow. Mrs. Vance? Evelyn stiffened, desperately trying to salvage her crumbling dignity. I found the letter after Arthur moved his private office files, she stammered stiffly. And then she hesitated, trapped in her own venom. I genuinely thought the empire should rightfully belong to Damien, because you believed Ms. Vance wasn't biologically related. Yes, the judge sneered with absolute disgust. And in your blind, greedy desperation, you didn't even consider that your own son might also be unrelated? Evelyn had absolutely no answer, she was entirely paralyzed. Damien looked utterly hollowed out, like someone had just violently pulled the floor out from beneath his feet. You mean, none of us? He whispered in sheer disbelief. Benjamin spoke with cold, calm finality. The incontrovertible DNA evidence suggests both children may have been catastrophically switched with other families. Damien leaned back, completely stunned into silence. Judge Harrison tapped his heavy mahogany desk lightly, the sharp sound demanding absolute attention. This court is absolutely not here to determine who belongs to which biological family 38 years later, he declared with unforgiving authority. He looked down at the massive pile of estate documents. We are here to determine legal inheritance. He turned his piercing gaze toward me. Ms. Alexandra Vance was flawlessly raised as Mr. Arthur Vance's legitimate daughter, he stated. He then shifted his eyes toward Damien. And Mr. Damien was raised as his son. He folded his hands, the weight of a $25 billion empire resting on his next words. Both individuals have worked within the corporation. Benjamin offered a single, sharp nod. Correct, Your Honor. However, the judge continued, his tone turning razor-sharp, the incontrovertible evidence undeniably shows that Ms. Vance spent decades shedding blood and sweat to meticulously build this company's monumental operational structure. Hargrave, the corporate shark, shifted violently uneasily in his chair. Judge Harrison's voice grew into a thunderous boom. Under New York law, inheritance rights are absolutely not determined solely by a sudden DNA revelation when decades of unshakable legal parentage and monumental contributions to the estate are clearly established. He picked up his wooden gavel. Everyone in the cavernous room collectively leaned forward, holding their breath. Therefore, the court officially recognizes Ms. Alexandra Vance as a sole, rightful heir to the Vance estate and its supreme corporate holdings. My breath violently caught in my throat. And based on the established share structure prior to the maliciously disputed will. Judge Harrison raised the gavel high. Ms. Alexandra Vance retains absolute, controlling shares of Vance Global Innovations. He brought the gavel down with a deafening, conclusive crack. The sound echoed like a gunshot through the archaic courtroom. For a suspended eternity, absolutely no one spoke. Then, with agonizing slowness, the paralyzed room began to violently exhale and move again. Damien stared blankly at the heavy mahogany table. Evelyn looked exactly like a shattered woman who had just watched decades of venomous, careful manipulation violently collapse into a pile of worthless ash. And my father. Arthur Vance finally turned his body and looked directly at me for the absolute first time in 5 agonizing years. But this apocalyptic bloodbath wasn't entirely over yet. Because there were still devastating words between us that had never been spoken. And the most profound, monumental conversation of my entire existence was about to take place just outside those heavy courtroom doors. When the executioner's hearing officially concluded, people didn't evacuate the courtroom immediately. That is the terrifying nature of a catastrophic family secret. Even when the judge permanently closes the file and the corporate sharks gather their lethal documents, the monstrous truth keeps violently moving through the room long after the legal slaughter is finished. I stood firmly beside the counsel table, one trembling hand resting on the rigid back of the chair while Benjamin Hayes quietly packed his leather briefcase. Well, he rasped dryly, sharply adjusting his glasses, I have certainly survived more peaceful Tuesdays. Despite the suffocating wreckage around us, I let out a hollow, exhausted laugh. Thank you, I breathed out. He offered me one of those sharp, old-fashioned nods that predatory men of his generation give when they mean astronomically more than they are willing to say out loud. You survived the absolute hardest part of the slaughter, Alexandra. Across the blood-stained room, Damien still hadn't physically moved a muscle. Evelyn was frantically speaking to Daniel Hargrave in a vicious, angry whisper, but her toxic voice had completely lost all the hypnotic polish it carried earlier that morning. She looked pathetically smaller now. Not necessarily older, just diminished, exactly like a manipulative parasite whose absolute certainty had finally, violently shattered. My father stood completely isolated a few feet away from them, not speaking a single word. For the very first time in decades, he looked significantly less like Arthur Vance, the ruthless billionaire industrial giant, and astronomically more like the exhausted, broken widower who once sat in a sterile hospital cafeteria desperately trying to pretend my mother was going to survive. I aggressively picked up my winter coat and turned to evacuate the battlefield. Alexandra. It was my father. His fractured voice stopped me dead in my tracks before I even reached the center aisle. I turned around with agonizing slowness. He took one hesitant step toward me, then another. Up close, I could vividly see the catastrophic strain etched into his face. He looked profoundly older than he had just that morning. Not merely by a few agonizing hours, but by decades. Can we please talk? He asked. Evelyn stiffened immediately, her defensive instincts flaring. Arthur, this is absolutely not the time, she hissed. He violently refused to even glance in her direction. Yes, he commanded quietly. It is. There was enough suffocating history in those 3 simple words to fill an entire, tragic lifetime. I quickly glanced at Benjamin. He offered a sharp, singular nod and tactfully walked out toward the marble hallway, granting us the battlefield's privacy without making a theatrical show of it. Damien suddenly stood up as well, looking utterly lost and uncertain. Dad? My father turned slightly toward the boy he had raised. His hardened expression miraculously softened. Not right now, son. That specific word hung suspended in the heavy air for a fraction of a second, son. And in that exact moment, I profoundly realized that despite all the catastrophic genetic tests, cutthroat legal slaughters, and apocalyptic hospital mistakes, some profound bonds miraculously survive simply because people fiercely decide they will. Damien lowered his defeated eyes and silently sat back down. I cautiously followed my father out into the freezing Manhattan hallway. The archaic corridor outside the probate court was lined with decaying wooden benches and cluttered bulletin boards that absolutely no one read unless they were trapped there. A broken vending machine buzzed obnoxiously near the brass elevators. Somewhere infinitely farther down the cavernous hall, a bailiff was loudly laughing at a joke another clerk had just made. The agonizingly ordinary courthouse life was proceeding exactly as if my entire universe hadn't just violently collapsed beneath my feet. My father and I stood isolated near a towering, frost-covered window overlooking the sprawling, icy Manhattan skyline. For an agonizingly long time, neither of us spoke a single syllable. Finally, I unleashed the catastrophic question that had been suffocating me. How long were you going to let me blindly believe I meant absolutely nothing to you? He closed his exhausted eyes briefly. That is absolutely not what this was, he rasped. It certainly looked exactly that way from where I was bleeding on the battlefield, I fired back. He offered one heavy, defeated nod. I know. The raw, pathetic honesty of that two-word answer disarmed my violent rage far more effectively than any manufactured corporate excuse ever could have. He placed both of his trembling hands heavily on the freezing windowsill and stared blankly out at the sprawling city. Your mother explicitly told me immediately after she unearthed those buried records, he confessed, his voice fracturing. She was already dying of the cancer by then. I stayed absolutely, paralyzingly quiet. She had been meticulously going back through some archaic medical paperwork, he continued. One of the original birth documents catastrophically failed to match the amended certificate. Then she started asking very dangerous questions. He swallowed hard, the guilt suffocating him. She deduced there had been an apocalyptic switch. And she explicitly ordered me not to tell you. She fiercely said, Alexandra is our daughter because we shed blood to raise her. She warned me, if we foolishly go chasing genetics after all these decades, we might violently destroy infinitely more lives than we could ever possibly heal. That sounded exactly, profoundly like my mother. She was flawlessly careful, deeply thoughtful, and infinitely more concerned with protecting other people's souls from pain than shielding her own. I defensively folded my arms against the creeping chill radiating from the window. Then why on earth did you maliciously rewrite the will to strip me of the empire? I demanded. He took a long, jagged breath. Because I was consumed by a suffocating, blinding anger, he confessed. At life, he added, violently shaking his head. At your mother for tragically dying and leaving me alone. At my own pathetic cowardice for never properly dealing with any of the wreckage. And at the catastrophic fact that once Evelyn unearthed that hidden letter, every single breathing moment in our house mutated into a vicious, toxic war. And there it was. It absolutely wasn't a grand, theatrical confession, nor was it a poetic speech worthy of a cinematic climax. It was just the ugly, pathetic, unflattering truth. Sometimes, that is exactly how broken people speak when they are finally, utterly too exhausted to keep up the lies. Evelyn relentlessly kept whispering that the entire corporation must rightfully go to Damien, he continued. That blood was the only currency that mattered. That biological legacy was supreme. He stopped abruptly and rubbed his forehead in sheer agony. After years of that psychological water torture, I cowardly allowed myself to start believing her toxic delusions, too. I glared at him with absolute, cold precision. You ruthlessly shouted it in open court. His face violently tightened with shame. I know. No father should ever commit a slaughter like that. No, he rasped, he absolutely shouldn't. For the very first time that apocalyptic day, the billionaire's voice completely broke. I am so deeply sorry, Alexandra. I had vividly hallucinated that exact moment so many thousands of times over the previous 5 hellish years that when it finally arrived, it didn't feel remotely victorious or dramatic. It just felt profoundly, suffocatingly sad. Because hollow apologies absolutely do not magically refund your violently stolen years. They do not resurrect the birthdays that passed in agonizing silence, or the holidays endured in freezing distance, or those cutthroat board meetings where the executives looked right through you as if you were already a buried ghost. But still, a raw, bleeding apology matters, especially when you have survived enough corporate bloodbaths to truly understand how staggeringly rare one can be. I finally forced out the ultimate, agonizing question that had been eating me alive for years. Did you ever, for a single second, love me less? He turned and locked his eyes directly onto mine with absolute, unshakable conviction. Never. Scalding tears violently flooded my eyes before I could physically suppress them. Then why on earth did you force me to fight this brutal, humiliating war? I demanded. He answered with the exact kind of devastating truth that absolutely no one wants to hear, but countless shattered families secretly know. Because unchecked pride is a catastrophic, cancerous poison when it silently settles into a house, and no one possesses the courage to violently cut it out. We stood paralyzed in that freezing hallway for a very long time. Then, I articulated something I had absolutely never planned to say. I am not going to legally annihilate Evelyn. His gray brows lifted slightly in shock. You easily could, he admitted. Yes, I stated coldly, but I am absolutely not going to. That was the exact, monumental moment I realized my relentless thirst for vengeance was permanently extinguished. Not because absolute justice hadn't mattered, it absolutely had. Exposing the monstrous truth mattered. The judge's ironclad ruling mattered. Ruthlessly protecting the $25 billion empire I had bled to build mattered. But if I squandered the remainder of my existence desperately trying to execute everyone who had betrayed me, then all I would really be doing is voluntarily surrendering the rest of my precious years to them. Exactly 1 week later, I ruthlessly convened my very first executive board meeting as the supreme, undisputed chairwoman of Vance Global Innovations. I mercifully allowed Damien to remain at the corporation, absolutely not because he had earned an ounce of supreme control, but because he had put in some time there, and because this apocalyptic genetic nightmare wasn't his fault either. I swiftly transferred him into a heavily monitored, structured operational role situated at a remote facility in upstate New York, astronomically far away from Evelyn's toxic manipulation and brutally close to the actual, grueling work. It was the absolute best purgatory for him to finally discover his own identity without a venomous parasite constantly whispering poison into his ear. As for Evelyn, she was permanently, humiliatingly banished from the board of directors. I didn't aggressively sue her. I didn't orchestrate a media slaughter to publicly annihilate her in the press. I simply allowed the devastating truth to do exactly what truth inevitably does over time. It violently settled the score exactly where it belonged. In the grueling months that followed the bloodbath, I aggressively established a formidable, multi-million-dollar foundation in my late mother's honor to legally and financially arm foster children, adoptees, and adults desperately hunting for their true family records after catastrophic hospital errors or shattered placements. We ruthlessly funded elite legal support, advanced counseling, and aggressive reunification operations wherever scientifically possible. Because if this apocalyptic ordeal taught me one absolute certainty, it is that family truth is not merely a fragile emotional concept. It is brutally practical. It catastrophically dictates your absolute identity, your legal inheritance, your genetic medical history, and your fundamental sanity. And battle-hardened survivors know this truth better than absolutely anyone else. If you cowardly refuse to put your legal affairs in ironclad order, your toxic silence will inevitably mutate into a monstrous burden that will utterly destroy someone else's life. So that is the ultimate, blood-soaked lesson I carry into the future. Fiercely love your family while you still possess the chance. Ruthlessly drag the truth into the light before it violently hardens into irreparable damage. Forge an impenetrable, bulletproof will, meticulously guard your records, and absolutely never confuse a financial inheritance with your own intrinsic human worth. Biological blood can merely dictate the exact geographical coordinates of where you started. But relentless love, monumental sacrifice, and unshakable loyalty, that is what writes the true, unbreakable legacy of exactly who raised you, who bled beside you on the battlefield, and who permanently belongs in your soul. Arthur Vance and I are still painstakingly, agonizingly healing from the wreckage. Apocalyptic wounds close incredibly slowly, but we now manage to share a quiet dinner together twice a month, typically on freezing Sunday evenings. Sometimes we fiercely debate the cutthroat corporate business. Sometimes we softly reminisce about my mother's profound grace. And sometimes, we simply sit in the suffocating quiet and miraculously allow that silence to be enough. After surviving a lifetime of corporate wars, true reconciliation rarely ever looks like a dramatic, cinematic climax. It simply looks like possessing the sheer courage to show up. It looks like absolute, grueling humility. It looks exactly like bleeding, and then stubbornly trying all over again. And if this catastrophic slaughter has resonated with the quiet, buried truths or the desperate need for family forgiveness in your own life, I urge you to brutally reflect on it. Maybe share it with someone who desperately needs to hear it, and pass it forward so monumental survival stories like this can keep finding the people they were meant to save. Some brutal wars end merely in a cold, legal victory. The truly legendary ones end in absolute, unshakable wisdom.